Danielle Smith just sent Mark Carney a letter that's basically the political equivalent of sliding into someone's DMs with, "Hey, I know we just met, but can you approve my pipeline because Venezuela's stealing my customers?" And folks, the sheer audacity combined with the questionable economics of this pitch is absolutely chef's kiss. We've got Alberta's premier using the return of Venezuelan oil to global markets as justification for a pipeline that's been controversial for years, conveniently ignoring some pretty massive holes in her own argument. But here's the thing, buried underneath the political opportunism and the sketchy logic, there's actually an interesting question about where Canadian oil fits in a changing global energy market. So let's break down why Smith's letter is simultaneously bold political maneuvering and possibly based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how oil markets actually work. Picture Danielle Smith sitting in her office in Edmonton, scrolling through energy news, and suddenly seeing headlines about Venezuelan oil production ramping up after years of sanctions. And you can practically see the light bulb go off. This is it. This is the angle. This is how she's going to pressure the new Prime Minister into approving a pipeline project that environmentalists hate, Indigenous groups have concerns about, and BC isn't exactly thrilled about either. She grabs her pen, probably opens her laptop, and fires off a letter warning about market share and competitive positioning and the rapidly changing global energy landscape. It's political theater, but it's well-executed political theater. Let's start with the basic claim. Venezuela's sitting on massive oil reserves, some of the largest in the world actually. For years, US sanctions kept most of that oil off global markets. Venezuelan production collapsed due to a combination of sanctions, mismanagement, underinvestment, and political chaos. But now there's talk of sanctions easing, production potentially ramping back up, and all that heavy crude finding buyers again. Smith's argument is that this Venezuelan oil will compete directly with Alberta's oil sands product, steal market share, and hurt Alberta's economy unless Canada can get more pipeline capacity to move product to Tidewater for export. On the surface, it sounds almost reasonable. More supply from Venezuela means more competition. More competition could mean lower prices or lost sales for Alberta. Therefore, Alberta needs more pipeline capacity to access more markets to offset this threat. Except, and this is a pretty big except, the logic falls apart when you actually think about where Venezuelan oil goes and what would replace it if it wasn't available. Smith mentions that Venezuelan oil goes mostly to China. That's true historically. China's been one of the few major buyers willing to ignore US sanctions and keep purchasing Venezuelan crude. But here's the question Smith doesn't want to answer in her letter. If Venezuelan oil wasn't available, would China just stop buying oil? Of course not. They'd buy it from somewhere else. Middle East, Russia, maybe even a bit more from Canada. The global oil market isn't a zero-sum game where Venezuelan barrels directly replace Alberta barrels. It's a complex interconnected system where supply and demand balance across multiple regions and suppliers. If Venezuela wasn't shipping oil to China, China would absolutely replace those barrels with oil from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Russia, or other suppliers. So the return of Venezuelan oil to the market doesn't necessarily mean Alberta loses Chinese customers because Alberta wasn't supplying most of China's oil anyway. What it might mean is that global oil prices face some downward pressure if Venezuelan supply increases significantly. But that's a price issue, not a market share issue, and a pipeline doesn't fix price problems. Now let's talk about this pipeline Smith's so eager to promote. She's referring to what's likely the proposed expansion or new pipeline from Alberta to the northwest coast of British Columbia. The pitch is that getting Alberta oil to Pacific Tidewater opens up Asian markets, particularly China and India, reducing dependence on the US market which currently takes the vast majority of Canadian oil exports. That's not an unreasonable goal. Diversifying export markets makes economic sense. Having all your eggs in the American basket creates vulnerability. But here's where things get complicated. Building pipelines through BC is politically fraught. There are environmental concerns about spills, particularly oil tanker traffic through sensitive coastal waters. There are Indigenous rights and title issues because the pipeline would cross traditional territories. There are local communities that don't want the infrastructure or the risk. Previous pipeline projects have faced massive protests, legal challenges, and years of delays. The Trans Mountain expansion took forever and cost way more than originally projected. Smith's acting like approval is the only thing standing between Alberta and Asian markets, conveniently ignoring all the other barriers. There's also the small matter of whether Asian markets even want more Canadian heavy crude at prices that make sense for Alberta. Canadian oil sands bitumen is heavy, high in sulfur, and requires specific refining capacity. Not every refinery can process it efficiently. China has refineries configured for heavy crude, which is good. But they've also got long-term supply agreements with Russia, Middle Eastern producers, and yes, potentially Venezuela. Breaking into that market in a meaningful way requires more than just pipeline capacity. It requires price competitiveness and buyers who actually want the product. Smith's letter warning about losing market share and investment is classic political fearmongering. She's creating urgency around a threat that may not be as dire as she's suggesting to pressure Carney into a decision that benefits Alberta's oil industry. And look, that's her job. She's the Premier of Alberta. Advocating for Alberta's economic interests is literally what she was elected to do. But that doesn't mean the rest of Canada has to accept her framing of the issue. The timing is also transparently opportunistic. Carney just became Prime Minister. He's trying to establish his leadership, build coalitions, and navigate competing regional interests. Smith sees an opening. A new PM who might be more sympathetic to resource development than Trudeau was. A chance to get a pipeline approval that's been stuck in political limbo. So she frames it as urgent and ties it to a global development that sounds threatening but maybe isn't as relevant as she claims. Let's also address the elephant in the room, or maybe the oil well in the room. Climate policy. Canada's committed to reducing emissions. The oil sands are emissions intensive. Every new pipeline that increases production capacity makes it harder to meet climate targets. Smith doesn't mention this in her letter, obviously, because it undermines her argument. But Carney can't ignore it. He's positioning himself as someone who takes climate change seriously. Approving a major new pipeline sends a signal about priorities, and that signal might contradict other things he's saying about environmental leadership. The global energy landscape really is changing. Smith got that part right. But it's not changing in the way she's suggesting. The change isn't about Venezuela returning to markets. The change is about the transition to renewable energy, electric vehicles, declining long-term oil demand projections, and pressure on high-emission sources like oil sands. Building massive new fossil fuel infrastructure in 2025 is a bet that oil demand will remain strong for decades. That might be a bad bet. Here's another fun wrinkle. Smith says any delay risks ceding market share. But to whom exactly? If the concern is Venezuela taking Canadian market share in China, well, Canada doesn't have significant market share in China to lose. The US takes about 97% of Canadian crude exports. The real risk isn't losing Chinese customers we don't have. The real risk is the US reducing imports of Canadian oil as they become more energy independent or shift to renewables. A pipeline to BC doesn't solve that problem either. There's also something almost charming about the premise that Mark Carney, who spent years as a central banker thinking about global economics and climate risk, is going to read this letter and go, oh my goodness, Venezuelan oil, I hadn't considered that, approve the pipeline immediately. Carney's a smart guy. His thought about energy markets. He knows the arguments for and against pipeline expansion. Smith's letter isn't revealing new information. It's applying political pressure. What Smith's really asking for is for the federal government to prioritize Alberta's short-term economic interests over environmental concerns, Indigenous rights, and British Columbia's preferences. That's a tough sell even for a sympathetic Prime Minister. Carney might be more open to resource development than some progressives want, but is not going to rubber stamp a controversial project just because a premier sent a letter invoking Venezuela. The question of whether Canada should be expanding oil production capacity in 2025 is legitimately debatable. There are good faith arguments on both sides. The pro side says we need economic growth, jobs, government revenue, and we might as well produce oil ourselves rather than importing it or letting other countries fill global demand. The con side says we're in a climate crisis, we need to transition away from fossil fuels, and building infrastructure that locks in emissions for decades is irresponsible. Smith's firmly on the pro side, which is unsurprising given she represents Alberta. But framing it as a response to Venezuelan oil is a rhetorical trick to make it sound urgent and defensive rather than expansionary. She's not saying let's grow the oil sands. She's saying we need to protect our market position. Same outcome, different framing, more politically palatable. The reality is that global oil markets are oversupplied more often than undersupplied. OPEC's constantly trying to manage production to maintain prices. US shale production can ramp up or down relatively quickly. Russia's still pumping. The Middle East has spare capacity. Adding Venezuelan barrels back into the mix might lower prices slightly, but it's not going to fundamentally reshape the market in ways that specifically hurt Alberta unless Alberta crude becomes uncompetitive on price or quality. And here's the kicker. If Alberta oil needs a new pipeline to remain competitive, maybe it's not as competitive as Smith wants to believe. Truly competitive products find markets without requiring billions in infrastructure subsidies and government approvals. The fact that the oil sands need pipeline capacity to reach buyers suggests those buyers aren't willing to pay enough to justify the full infrastructure cost, which raises questions about the long-term viability of expanded production. Smith's letter is a masterclass in political advocacy. Take a global development, frame it as a threat, propose your preferred solution, and pressure the new guy to act quickly before he's had time to think it through. It's clever. It's strategic. It might even work if Carney decides he needs Alberta's political support for other priorities. But it's also built on some pretty shaky economic logic. Venezuelan oil returning to markets isn't an existential threat to Alberta. It's one of many factors affecting global oil prices and supply. Building a pipeline to BC might help Alberta access new markets, or it might be an expensive infrastructure project that delivers less economic benefit than promised while creating environmental and social costs that last for generations. So what does Carney do with this letter? Does he approve the pipeline to keep Alberta happy and show he's different from Trudeau? Does he reject it and face Smith's wrath and attacks about killing Alberta jobs? Does he study it to death and delay any decision indefinitely? Each option has political consequences, and Smith knows it. That's why she sent the letter. She's putting him on the spot, making him choose, and whatever he chooses, someone's going to be angry. If you want to follow how this pipeline drama unfolds, and trust me there will be developments because Smith's not going to drop this quietly, subscribe to Canadian Insights. We're covering every angle of Canadian politics multiple times daily, breaking down the real story behind the political spin. Hit that like button if this breakdown of Smith's Venezuelan oil argument made you think twice about the logic, and drop a comment with your take. Should Carney approve this pipeline, or is Smith's reasoning as flimsy as it sounds? I'll see you in the next video where we'll probably be covering whatever new pressure campaign Smith launches when this letter doesn't get the immediate response she wants.